I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am joined by award-winning author John Wray, with 6 books that range in subject but with an intensity all his own. His newest novel, Gone to the Wolves, is a nonstop ride from Florida to LA to Scandinavia, all in the world of heavy metal, following a group of young people that are really pushed sort of to the edge of their beliefs. John, thanks for being with us today.
It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I want to get started just laying out the book because,
Sure.
like I said, a lot happens. We want to stay spoiler-free because I think people really need to experience all of this for themselves. But do you just want to sort of lay out the premise of Gone to the Wolves for us?
Well, as you mentioned, Gone to the Wolves is set in the world of heavy metal, and particularly heavy metal sort of super fandom in the 1980s and 1990s, which is about around the time when I was a teenager and when I was listening to music in a really kind of fanatical, passionate way. I still am a passionate music listener, but I think there's like a way, those first bands that really kind of blow your mind. I mean, it's like first love, it's just more intense than anything else. In that world of kind of metal super fans in the 80s, it's really about a friendship between 3 kids, 3 teenagers who are initially drawn together by their shared love of metal, and particularly a kind of underground, a little bit more extreme kind of metal, not so much Poison or Whitesnake, and more, dark, scary bands with names like Deicide and Obituary and things like that, So it's really a book about 3 friends coming together and sort of growing up together, trying to become adults together, mostly failing to become adults together, and just how they survive roughly a decade in their young lives.
Like I said, these characters in this plot, it runs the gamut from things that we all maybe experienced in young adulthood to things that I think many of us did not.
No, probably not. Hopefully not.
Yeah, but I'll let readers discover all that for themselves. I think one of the things that, I was drawn to the book immediately seeing the cover because I'm a Midwest metalhead myself.
Congratulations.
And had to, as soon as I saw it, I was like, I need that. I need that in my life. Because it is such a distinct community. And when you sort of grow up, especially a lot of young people who grow up listening to that kind of music and in those communities and at those shows, it's such a distinct memory and such a core feeling for all of us. But can you tell us all about how you sort of came upon this story and how you sort of decided that this was a book that you wanted to write and a story you wanted to tell?
Even though it's such a kind of metal book in a certain way, it didn't really begin with the idea of wanting to write about metal at all. I wanted to write about my teenage years and the friends that I had in those days, some of whom were pretty hilarious and pretty crazy, and how each of us kind of came to terms with childhood slowly ending. And of course, a passionate devotion to music and to a musical scene is one of the ways that people kind of make that crazy, scary transition from childhood to adulthood, I suppose. It gives you a sense of community, even if you don't have that at home or at school even. So I really wanted to write about the friendship between these kids and in a way, find a way of writing about some people that I knew. And of course, my own feelings and experiences, falling in love the first time and just trying to stay alive and not get beaten up too much, and these sorts of things that I think a lot of people in more or less scary high schools have to deal with. And then it was kind of triggered because I think, like most writers, I have a lot of possibilities floating around in my head, and they don't all turn into books. Probably it's all for the best that they don't. But I bumped into this, I got to know this kid in New York City, maybe 15 years ago, who was from this very interesting, strange, not often visited part of Florida, which is sort of this area that encompasses sort of central Florida, west over to maybe some towns that we have heard of, like Sarasota or Tampa. And he was this kind of outsider, oddball kid, really into art and weird, freaky things. And he himself was not a metalhead, but in the course of these amazing stories that he told me about how strange it was to grow up in that part of Florida, extreme metal just kind of came up again and again and again. And a lot of his friends were metalheads. So that just kind of got me remembering what it was like to grow up in Buffalo, New York, which is where I'm from, which was just dominated by metal when I was growing up, of all varieties. In fact, the very first sentence of the novel name checks of, sort of the biggest Buffalo metal band ever, Cannibal Corpse, partially because that's just an amazing crazy name. And I thought it was a fun way to begin a book, but it was also a tip of the hat to, the sort of world of metal that I grew up in.
How did you find the research process for this? Because there is so much detail in this story. Not only just real people, real bands, real everything that you include, but you make the world so rich. You really break us into this insular community group and allow readers to feel, whether or not they've ever listened to a metal song, that they've ever been to a concert, that they really understand what this world is like. So when you were researching this novel, how did you include all those pieces and find a way to really show us what this world is like?
Well, first of all, it was incredibly fun.
Okay.
It was the most fun I've ever had writing a book, hands down. But it wasn't always easy because I really wanted to write a novel that was fun and accessible and interesting, even for people who have no interest in metal whatsoever. I really thought about it the way, the last novel I wrote was set in Afghanistan, and had to do with the Taliban and things like that. Again, I didn't write that book thinking like, I'm writing a novel for people who are interested in the United States involvement in Afghanistan. That's not how you write a book. You should always write a book thinking, what would be interesting? What's an interesting world to bring the reader into that maybe he or she may not be familiar with, So doing the research was very easy because, again, it's a world that I sort of grew up in and around. And I had all these amazing stories of friends of mine, including the kid I mentioned from Florida. But really, the trick was how to take all of this background and all of this research, which may be true for any novel, and just not make it a burden on the narrative. Just only make use of the research that you've done when it will make the novel more fun and more exciting or more interesting in some way. I always feel like research is important for the writer so that he or she kind of reaches a point where they feel comfortable making things up and telling a story. It's more for grounding you, the writer, than it is for educating the reader in any way. To me, this book is about metal, but I could have been writing about gangs in Rio de Janeiro or hardcore Dungeons and Dragons enthusiasts. It's just, what's an interesting world that really kind of begs to have a story told in it and through it and about it in some way.
I won't spoil sort of the last third of the book because there's a lot that happens there that you maybe wouldn't have exactly anticipated when you first start in Florida. But did you know that that's where you wanted to go? How did you incorporate sort of that Norwegian storyline in? Yes. When you started writing about just these young people and their experiences, was that always there, or did that sort of come through when you were doing that research?
Well, I always wanted to tell a story that would follow 3 metal hardcore super fans through a few different phases of that subculture and different genres of music as well. The book really is divided into 3 almost equal parts. The first one is in this interesting part of Florida that I came to know a bit about, and I spent some time down there. And that's a certain type of metal as well. It's a genre of metal called death metal, which is very loud and very scary and very hard to listen to. But the guys who make it are actually, most of them, quite lovable and quite sweet, which was my experience in most metal scenes that I was ever a part of, either as a fan or as a music journalist later. So I knew that it was going to start with death metal in Florida. Then when the kids, when they got out of high school and really wanted to strike out as adults, I knew I wanted to go to LA because that was this very interesting time in LA music, especially in the kind of metal scene, in which there was this battle for the future of the music between bands that we call hair metal or glam metal bands, that were making huge amounts of money and all over MTV. And then this kind of more underground garage, uglier, maybe slightly more honest or politically engaged, more punk influenced metal called thrash that was kind of coming up, of which by far the most famous example would be Metallica. And then, it was almost inevitable to me that I would end up in the last third of the book going to Scandinavia and to Norway, because I'm roughly the same age, actually, as the characters in the book. And I remember very clearly in the early 90s hearing about this incredibly creepy, scary stuff that was happening in Sweden and particularly in Norway. These bands that were not only making scary music, they were actually trying to practice what they preached, essentially, rather than pretending to be evil, but actually being cuddly. These were people who were very young kids, actually, most of them teenagers, mid sort of 15, 16, 17 years old, who were maybe too young to even get that the value of the theater of metal, and that it's a release and a fantasy, and that most of it should be taken metaphorically. They were taking it very seriously. They were burning down churches. They were trying to kill each other. There's a lot of really scary stuff. And I remember being the same age as the characters in the book and hearing about this stuff and thinking, oh my God, this is terrifying, but of course also fascinating. It was just too much to resist to not take my characters there for the last third of the book. And again, it was just a world and a subculture that I knew was just kind of begging to be written about in a novel. I mean, to my knowledge, there hasn't really been a serious attempt to write about this world in a novel. So that in and of itself was exciting to me.
There's such a care for someone like me who is familiar with this subculture, but also grew up after a lot of this had already happened. And so only heard about things. And again, being from the Midwest, where there's a lot of Scandinavian people, we did hear about, I always grew up hearing about those like Norwegian bands and stuff. But then it was also sort of just used against the culture, the group as a whole. A lot of people saying, well, of course, that's what that's like. And it sort of becomes skewed in that way.
Right.
But for most of us growing up, you did have that great community sense. And so it's such a book that's written with care for the community in a way that often writers who write about these insular communities, they maybe don't understand that, you want to write from a respectful way, even if you're writing about something like that isn't something you'd approve of. Yeah. Even in Godsend, a similar thing, there's so much care taken with those characters. When you're writing about these insular groups, do you feel, not responsibility, that's too much of a strong word, but, you want to take that care and that respect when you're writing for these groups that people don't understand?
First of all, if you don't write with a sense of respect, I mean, that respect that you talk about comes from understanding. It comes from really trying to understand someone and really trying to see the world from their perspective and walk a few miles in their shoes. So if you don't do that, you're going to write bad novels anyway, or bad short stories, bad prose, bad essays. It doesn't matter. I mean, that respect to me is almost like a byproduct of just trying to write a really good book that's real and that's nuanced and isn't just some sort of ironic spoof. Years ago, I wrote a novel about a schizophrenic teenager, and I remember thinking as I was writing it, I just don't want this book to end up being part of the problem. There's so much misunderstanding around schizophrenia and mental illness. I don't want to add to that misunderstanding. So there was a feeling of responsibility there, and that's fine. I think that's a very good motivator. That's sort of, it's more than responsibility. It's like fear of just sucking, It's like, I don't want to write some garbage that people are going to dismiss and that people who've had these experiences will tell me is totally inaccurate. Also, I just love sort of loud, heavy underground music of any kind. That's sort of what I was reared on. I mean, for me, it was hugely important. It gave me a sense of community and a strangely a sense of what was possible artistically, that there were people out there who could make things that were terrifying to your average sort of, music fan, but they could somehow find a way of making that also beautiful and surviving in that world and maybe even, making that their whole way of life. That's just exciting to me, whether you're talking about punk rock or you're talking about metal or you're talking about even more obscure things like writing novels.
Sure.
If you go deep enough and you have love for it, it might just give you a sort of reason for living, not to get too dramatic here.
Sure. But for so many people, and for your characters in this book, Kira and Kip and Leslie Z, some of the best characters, they find this and it does give them, sort of that reason, that community. And yes, they go through a lot of, trials and tribulations with each other and with their communities in general. But it really does offer readers who have experienced something, whether, like you said, whether it's with metal music or with Dungeons and Dragons or with football or whatever that might have been that for them growing up. I think there's going to be an insight there.
Yeah, or with gaming, or with people who like to do cosplay, or with people who are passionately devoted to obscure English sort of parlor mysteries of the early 20th century, or
Sure.
people who go birding. These are all ways that outsiders and people who feel marginalized or just misunderstood or just out of place, these are all systems of meaning that they can find, and ways of seeing the world as a beautiful place and a place full of promise rather than just a dead end.
Kip sort of is the character whose voice we follow through most of this book. And there were a lot of moments where I was like, Kip, you got to get it together. You got to get it together.
I felt the same way.
Yes. How did you find his voice? Was his the first voice that came to you? When you're writing these stories, do you start with plot and you sort of find the characters on the way, or is it a voice in your head that starts?
I definitely do not start with plot. Gone to the Wolves has a lot of plot, and it kind of moves from sort of coming of age novel to something almost like almost like a thriller towards the end, because one of these three friends vanishes and the other two friends go to Norway to try to figure out what happened. So there's an element of mystery to it. But the plot to me has to arise out of the tensions and the situations between the various characters. So it really starts with characters. Leslie Z is probably my favorite character in the book, and he's kind of taken whole cloth from a dear friend of mine who loves to argue with me about music and is a terrible, insufferable know-it-all about every type of music you can imagine. I can't tell you who it is because he's quite a famous writer, so I would probably get in trouble. But I think it's a loving portrait. So in a way, the main friendship story maybe began with that character, with Leslie Z, who's a very eccentric, very unusual metal fan, because, for all sorts of reasons. He's this slightly well-off kid in kind of nowhere, Florida, who was, however, adopted by these very old adopted parents. He's African-American, he's bisexual, he's very flamboyant. He ought to be just dead, basically. And yet, ironically, the way that he's found to survive in a part of the country that's not very open to his identity and just who he is naturally is through heavy metal, the last place you'd imagine that he would find shelter, So that was kind of a fun thing for me to try and write about.
Leslie Z has one of the best introductions in the book that I've seen. Readers, you're going to love it. His character is truly one of those great rocks throughout this whole thing. Even when you are upset at Kip or worried about Kira, you always have Leslie Z to sort of bring things back. And even when you're worried about any of them, you always know that you hope that they're going to find their way sort of back together, even through these sort of ways that they pull apart and the tensions that they face. But you never shy away from sort of filling out your novels with these really intense and interesting side characters, supporting characters. The tapestry you create with all of these different people that they meet along the way, whether it's Kira's cousin in Florida or some of the band members in LA, to the real people or based on real people that they meet in Norway towards the end. How do you sort of create these tapestries, and how do they weave together these character pieces that, aren't our focal point?
Well, that's one of the most fun things, in a way, is writing these kind of supporting characters, I suppose you could say, or even the characters who just have a little walk-on part, especially when you're writing about a scene and a culture that's as colorful and at times outlandish as metal and underground metal can be. You can kind of have fun with your, I don't like to call them minor characters because they are important sometimes, with your sort of supporting characters. You can go places and you can be funny in ways that you can't always be when you're kind of trying to stay focused on the big picture and the big themes, I suppose you could say, or the story points. In writing about the world of metal, there were so many chances to have really amazing, sometimes hilarious, sometimes creepy sort of cameo appearances. Also because I knew from the beginning that the book, since there aren't really any novels about metal, since metal has kind of been neglected as a subject matter in favor of every other type of kind of popular underground music, I had to try and at least kind of gesture in the direction of the incredible diversity and vitality and just the color of this world that these characters are moving through. Yeah, I love those minor characters. I think There was once an interview with the Italian director Federico Fellini, and the interviewer asked him about what his favorite thing was about making films. Fellini was famous for making these very wild, often sort of surreal, very Italian. Like he directed La Dolce Vita and 8.5 and movies like that. And he immediately said, "Oh, the faces." And the interviewer was like, "I don't know. I'm not sure I understand. You just mean the physical faces?" He's like, "Well, yes, I have to tell a story, but then I get to put all these people in the background and crossing the room and they all have the craziest faces. Their faces are so amazing." And he just went off and how these strange faces that he put in the background of his movies was his favorite thing. But I understand what he means, because these little quick sketches that can sometimes be far out, that's a lot of fun. It's almost like taking a tiny little smoke break, from the main work of the novel. And you're like, oh, this would be so great. Or sometimes you remember some crazy person, some wild person you met, and you think, oh, maybe I could, that couldn't be a main character, but she could be kind of like at the next table in this scene, that's awfully fun.
Well, it makes it so much more rich and enjoyable. I mean, this book doesn't let you take a breath really at any point. You kind of just have to, like, I read this mostly in one sitting, because every time I would try and stop, I'd be like, well, I just kind of need to see that one next thing. And then that one next thing turned into, and now I've finished the book.
Oh, that's great.
You never really give us an opportunity to slow down or stop. But I think like any great metal song, why would you want to slow down?
Yeah, metal songs aren't really known for their like long, quiet, relaxing interludes.
No, you got to keep that momentum, keep going. When you're writing, how do you keep that momentum? Do you find that as a conscious choice? Like I need to keep going because I have so much plot that I have to sort of put this all out there? Or is it the way that the characters interact? Because like I said, you don't get a breath in this book. All of a sudden you're like, and it's done.
Well, that's great. I did want it to sort of accelerate towards the end, to have it taking your time at the beginning and then kind of get faster and faster. On the most basic boneheaded level, as a writer, you're asking yourself, would I want to read this? Am I still engaged? Am I still entertained? I mean, there's a huge amount of cutting, of course, that happens. You can't always be on top of it. Sometimes you get kind of distracted, like a bird seeing like a magpie seeing a little glittery button over there. You think, oh, maybe I should write a chapter about, the iconography of metal band T-shirts and band logos, and maybe it's fascinating stuff. And then before you know it, you have written an entire chapter going into the fine points of metal T-shirts and why would you want a logo for a band to be unreadable to most people and all of these weird things. But of course that immediately got cut. I mean, that just had to go. That would only be something that a tiny little fraction of very nerdy obsessives would ever want to read.
There's a scene early on when they're at a concert and they can't make out the name of a band. Like there's a band performing and they can't tell. And I think like for most people who've been to metal shows or like many concerts in general, like those local shows where you're like, who is this? Yeah. And maybe it's because you absolutely want to see them again, or maybe it's because you absolutely want to make sure you never see them again, but you can't figure out the name and then you can't read the name on the T-shirt and you're just trying to ask people. That's very relatable.
Yeah. And, sometimes you can do that. You can write a chapter and then condense it down into a single little funny moment, and you realize then later, I mean, that's what editing is for. You realize, oh, that's all I really needed.
Was there a lot of this book on the cutting room floor? Are there many more adventures of these three that we may never see?
No, I mean, most of their adventures are in there. I got rid of some, these kids all come, or two of the three good friends who kind of drive the novel. There's Kip, who, as you said, is in a way kind of our point of view. Then there's Ira, who Kip is kind of in love with for most of the book, who's kind of the coolest of the three. And then there's Leslie Z, who we mentioned. But Kip and Kira really both come from very rough backgrounds. And there was an earlier version of the book where we really went deep into those backgrounds. And there were some pretty uncomfortable chapters in there. I can write dark stuff. That's the sort of what I have done for most of my career. So I was kind of enjoying the writing or thinking it was well written or something, but that doesn't matter. And eventually I realized it's understood with just small gestures, that these are kids who have something they're trying to get away from. not only are they going into the world of metal, but they're trying to get away from some family stuff and other things. And then there's a lot of, again, there was a lot of geeking out and random, really kind of, for me, very fun stuff. A lot of descriptions of like crazy metal shows and stuff. And I realized maybe one of those is enough, or one or two, again, like if people want to, they can listen to the music, they can go see the shows. So I just really tried to keep it as fun as possible and as entertaining as possible. There are some kind of quote unquote literary writers who are very protective of that designation or that identity, and will almost talk about entertainment as something that is inherently suspect. And I've never believed that. I mean, if you look at the glory days when the novel was kind of first not created, but kind of developed into what we understand it to be now, Charles Dickens or the Brontes or, people from that era, they were very much trying to entertain as well as whatever else they may have been interested in doing. And I've never understood why novels shouldn't try to do both.
Absolutely. And like you said, some of your previous novels would be generously called intense. They tackle some pretty hefty subjects.
Yeah.
And some pretty hefty themes. And not that this book doesn't. I mean, there's plenty of heavy themes or, things to delve into in Gone to the Wolves, but it is at heart an entertaining, fun novel. And
That's
it's
what I was going for.
And you did it. Don't worry. And it's a coming of age story. I mean, so many of your novels are coming of age stories, but they're maybe skewed in ways that are not quite the traditional coming of age story. Thinking Lowboy, maybe. Many of your books take place at these sort of pivotal moments in your characters' lives. Do you think that just lends well to novels, or do you go sort of looking for those moments where we change?
Definitely, absolutely. And I think if you look at virtually any novel, no matter what it's about, it could be, a speculative fiction novel, it could be a Stephen King novel, what will drive the plot forward and will make it suspenseful will be these periods of intense testing and intense change, transformative moments, forks in the road, all these things. One's teenage years, early 20s. I mean, those pivot points and those crisis points they're more tightly packed together than they are later in life, probably. I feel as though I just have such crystal clear memories of such intense emotion from my miserable teens into my somewhat better 20s. They're like little bells inside of me, and all I need to do is think about age 17, and that bell will ring again just as clearly as it did the first day. There's a huge appeal for a writer in going to those moments that they remember most vividly, especially from the emotional side of things, going back to when you felt the most. That said, I'm older now. I still have feelings. So my next book will probably not be about 18-year-olds or 24-year-olds. Maybe I'll work on 48-year-olds instead.
I mean, there's something about being that age where everything feels like life or death. And sometimes in your books, it is life or death.
Yeah.
But for a lot of these young people, everything feels like that. It's that invincibility you feel when you're 18 and you feel like you can take on anything. And then you really quickly, life shows you exactly what it's going to be for the next however many years. And you really encounter a lot of those.
That's right.
Challenges.
Yeah, for sure. When I think about those books, I really find myself drawn to writing about first love. The first time that a character feels actual love for someone else. That can, of course, be through friendship, or it can be all sorts of things. I mean, for these kids, it's also the music that they're passionate about. But it is very much also a love story. In a way, it's a kind of multi-directional love story. Each of these three characters, in one way, is in love with the other, and feels a profound friendship towards everyone. But it is about first love for me. It's about Kip falling in love with Kira, and that in and of itself is how he becomes an adult, trying to figure out what that means, trying to make that connection with her, then trying to make a relationship with her work as grown-ups living in Los Angeles and not even being able to, pay the rent, and then seeing that not go the way that he hoped, and the lessons that he learns. Kira grows up through it, Kip grows up through it, Leslie as well. Probably first love is if I had to pick a single most potent and valuable subject to write novels about, it would have to be that, corny as it sounds.
I think that those moments are sort of the most vivid that stick out, those like interconnections between those characters. and those moments where Kip realizes how he feels about Kira and sort of the actions it leads him to take. And also the way that we sort of see each of those characters relate to falling in love with music and seeing how it can provide that for them as well, that community, that sense, that first love.
Yeah.
And it all goes back to the music. So I have to ask, do you listen to music when you write? What was the soundtrack for writing this book? Because it feels like I was listening to a lot of metal while I was reading, and I don't normally listen to music when I read, but I felt like I had to soundtrack it. So what was that like?
You know, my relationship to listening to music when I'm working is a very complex and fraught and kind of guilty one, because usually I feel as though I shouldn't be doing it. You know, I feel as though maybe I'll be more focused, more concentrated, just a better writer if I can have the discipline to just go into a silent white room and forget that I even exist and just try to work. And so some days that I can do that, but a lot of days I feel like I need a little something to carry me through it. You know, I guess mainly just so you don't feel so lonely while you're doing it or something. I don't know. I did listen to music quite a bit while I was writing this book. But what I realized about myself is the music I listen to while writing can't have any human voices in it of any kind, and shouldn't be too attention grabbing or too invasive in any way. So I became more and more kind of into, or I just spent more and more of my time listening to types of metal. You know, metal is an unbelievably varied musical genre, and there are types of metal that you could never listen to while you're writing. You know, like death metal, for example. I don't know if anyone could do that. But then, especially in the last few decades, it's also gone in these other very far more minimalistic directions. Played a friend some of the songs I was writing to, and he said, "Oh, this isn't even metal," you know. So I listened to quite a lot of a band called Earth from Seattle that they play these very repetitive, drony kinds of songs with almost never any singing at all. And then the best music actually for me to write this book to was an even more obscure band, probably from Los Angeles, called Sun. That's it's spelled Sunn, and then it has this weird symbol behind it. People sometimes think they're called Sun O because it looks like a sun. Most of their music has no vocals, no drumming. I listen to a lot of drony guitar, you know, sort of, if you could imagine Philip Glass, but with distorted guitars. That's the kind of stuff I listen to, right?
I always wonder what people listen to when they write, because when I'm working, I can never decide what works best to listen to, but I agree that things with no lyrics are kind of the way to go on that. So I'm always looking for new recommendations on something to get me through my work. I heard that there's a theme song maybe for this book through Instagram. I'm intrigued by that.
Well, that again, that's just sort of to emphasize the sort of fun aspect of this whole thing. I don't think I even realized when I started writing the book how much fun it was going to be for me. Not just to revisit these memories that I had and so on, but I would say even more than that, just, you know, the world of metal and is really such a colorful kind of like dramatic, you know, with a real awareness of how funny it all is from the people involved. It's just such an amazing kind of community and culture to write about. Even the language that is used, and of course all the visuals. It's every writer's dream to find that kind of material. So I had a lot of fun writing it, and then I've been having a lot of fun kind of thinking about things we could do to celebrate its publication. And I also play music and have since I was a teenager, mostly terrible, but always fun. So a friend happened to have access to a kind of big Manhattan studio that was empty. He knew somebody who knew somebody. And so we got free time to try and on the spot make up sort of an anthem for the novel, or a theme song for the novel. So we went in there and we cranked everything up to 11, and we plugged in all the weird distortion pedals, and we just bashed away. We made this funny little, very short, 90-second little song called "Gone to the Wolves" that will be done soon. And I guess we'll put, you know, maybe even FSG will be so bold as to put it up on their social media somewhere. Not the greatest song in the world, but a lot of fun to make.
Oh, I look forward to it, because that is a great accompaniment to any book. Why don't all books have theme songs? I think they should.
I think maybe from now on they all should.
Yes. All right. I like to always wrap up with sort of a couple important questions. One of
Sure.
them is, what is a book that you've read recently that you think everyone has to read? What's your big recommendation right now?
Oh, I just read the new novel by Catherine Lacey, Biography of X, which I thought was really beautiful. In a way, it's a portrait of herself and her understandings of herself as a person who loves other people and as a person in relationships and as a woman in the United States, and all of these things that are very, very worth going into. But also, you can just tell she had fun with writing the book, and I always love reading novels or nonfiction, although it's more common in novels, where you can just really tell that the person just had a blast writing this book. It doesn't mean it's any less weighty or serious in terms of its import, but you can just tell reading Catherine Lacey's latest novel that she had a great time writing it. If the writer is excited, I think the reader will be excited. And it's as simple as that.
And my final question, what's next for you, John Wray? Have you started your next book? They always say, you should start working on something when you've got something else. And
they say that, and for quite a long time I did that. I was a good little chipmunk, working away, trying to follow that sort of trollop code, or like the I think the Graham Greene approach, which is, if you finish the novel and you've only written 200 words that day, you need to write 300 more of the next project. That's crazy. But I thought I might this time around, but I have a young son who's 2 years old. When my wife and I are down here in Mexico, where I am right now, because she's from Mexico, we have a huge family to help us, but we're not down here most of the time. So I'm not really working on anything. I'm just trying to get, Julian to eat his vegetables, frankly,
Sure.
right now.
And why not bask in the sort of appreciation for Gone to the Wolves? Because this is a great book, and I can't wait so much. I can't wait for all of our listeners to get their hands on it. So Gone to the Wolves, it's out now. John Wray, thank you so much for this conversation today. It's been great.
Thank you. It's been a blast.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Topoff. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Gone to the Wolves. I'm Mark, coming to you from my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by my book buddy, Madyson. Hi, Madyson.
Hello, I'm Madyson, coming to you from my store in Los Angeles.
So why don't you go ahead and kick us off with a fantastic pick?
I would love to kick this one off. So when I was thinking of a book to recommend for Gone to the Wolves, I decided to go with a recently released novel, and that is YN by Esther Yi. I chose this one because I find it so fascinating, because as a person who enjoys K-pop, I like listening to K-pop. I think it is so intriguing, just that sector of music, and learning about it, and the culture around it, and the lifestyle around it. This book was right up my alley. So this is a fiction novel, and it centers around our narrator. You never learn her name. It's just YN. So she is a Korean American woman living in Berlin, but her obsession with a K-pop idol sends her to Seoul, South Korea. Her obsession is the only thing running her life. It's the only thing she can think about. She ditches her boyfriend, job, life in Germany, all of it. She's like, I'm gonna get rid of it all. I only care about Moon. He's my lifeblood. I only care about him. He's my main focus. So she does it. She leaves her old life behind, moves, and she's like, I'm gonna have my YN moment. And when he meets me, he'll fall in love with me. And I think this book highlights so well the idolization of idols. That's why they're called idols. It's so their fans can idolize them, so they can idolize them as their ideal types, the ideal man, the ideal woman. And this book does it so well, and kind of also shows you kind of that toxic headspace that some fans can get into, of when you idolize someone so much, that obsessive behavior that kind of can take over. And you have our narrator, she begins to write a fanfic, which, as we know, fan fiction writing, this isn't a dig on fan fiction writing. We all got to start our stories somewhere, and some of them turn into really, really great books. There are a lot of people joke and well, this used to be a Star Wars fanfic, or a like Twilight fanfic or Harry Styles. Like those are out there, and then like they become actual fantastic novels. So I just want to put out there, this is not a dig on fan fiction writers, all right? It's just a part of the story. So she starts to write basically her ideal life, her YN life with her idol. And through a bunch of like twists and turns, she finds herself, there's a lot of miscommunication, misidentification, mistranslation. She finds herself at the entertainment company of her idol after he retires and vanishes. So she finds herself in her own like YN moment. And I don't want to spoil anything because I think this book is an amazing read. I think it was done so well. But if you want a book that is fascinating and you want a glimpse into the over idolization of K-pop and K-pop idols, I would highly recommend it. I think it was fantastically written. That's all I can say.
Excellent. As soon as that book had come into the store, I thought, oh, this is a Madyson book. Absolutely. I'm sure that she saw this come her way up in the Grove.
As like a fan of K-pop, I was like, I don't know how I could get to that level.
It's intense. I love it. Well, I chose a book that I kind of count as sort of a fun companion to Gone to the Wolves, and that is the book Louder Than Hell, The Definitive Oral History of Metal. It's put out by John Widerhorn and Catherine Turman. This is essentially a perfect companion. You can bolster your fiction reading experience with true accounts of the music industry and specifically the metal movement. It just helps surge the prose on even more. It's almost 800 pages. It's a whopper of a tome, but it is very accessible. You can read it start to finish and get a semi-historical, chronological account of the metal movement, or you can pinpoint your favorite bands and focus on those, or you can just kind of jump around because it's full of interviews. It's full of fantastic photographs. It's got just a great commentary on all things metal and about music in general. It covers 25 years of the genre, and it discusses sort of like the seedlings of the beginnings of metal, highlights iconic artists, and then starts to kind of pave the way a little bit for the future of music. The interviews are full of fun anecdotes, to be sure, but collectively, I think they create this really interesting tapestry of a musical lifestyle that I think has influenced our culture in so many ways. If you want something to kind of add an extra meal to Gone to the Wolves, I think that Louder Than Hell is a fantastic way to do so. So Louder Than Hell, John Widerhorn, Catherine Turman, fantastic read. So check it out. That's all we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester.
And I'm Madyson. You can follow my home store at BN Events Grove.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Happy reading. Bye.
Happy reading. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.